Yeah, so without further ado, we'll be introducing the first speaker. I'm just going to keep introductions short so that we have plenty of time for the talk and the question and answers. So we have Jacqueline Fulvio from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who's going to be talking about gender imbalance in citation practices, specifically in cognitive neuroscience. Take it away, Jacqueline.
Great, thanks. So the proportion of papers authored by women in the first and or last authorship position of henceforth women-led papers has steadily increased over the last 2 decades in 5 broad scope neuroscience journals. This categorical authorship gender breakdown can serve as a proxy for the field of neuroscientists defining categorical citation base rates if gender is not a factor in citation choices. A recent study by Jordan Dworkin, Daniel Bassett, and colleagues investigated whether citations in the 5 broad scope neuroscience journals reflected these base rates. Instead, articles published by men as the first and last authors, henceforth articles, have been cited more frequently than the base rate, whereas women-led publications have been cited less frequently than the base rates. But this, of course, is a broad view of a diverse field with many subfields. And so we asked whether this trend generalizes to more focused domains where base rates and citation practices may look different from the field as a whole. We focused on the subfield of cognitive neuroscience, and we reviewed authorship and citation patterns in the subfield's flagship journal, the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. In the last decade or so, as we can see here, the categorical gender breakdown in authorship has generally been stable with a slight upward trend in the proportion of WW papers. Also noteworthy is the fact that the percentage of women-led publications has been markedly larger than that of the broad scope journals. As with the broad scope journal investigation, we'll define citation base rates according to this categorical authorship gender breakdown in JoCN. But before we can reveal the journal citation practices, I'll step back just a bit and explain the approach we took with the help of a talented undergraduate, Larry Akinola. I'll briefly describe the method, saving discussion of the more nuanced details for the discussion period. So we downloaded and organized metadata for the 2,106 research articles published in JoCN from January 2009 to July 2020, a snippet of which can be seen here. These metadata were combined with the metadata from the 5 broad scope journals analyzed previously. We then probabilistically determined the gender category of each JoCN article. In an example article, the first author was named Simon and the last author was named Sabrina. These names were queried within the Social Security Administration's baby name dataset, and if they weren't found there, through genderapi.com, which relies on census and social media data. And that allowed us to obtain the probability of the name belonging to a man and woman. If the probability of belonging to either gender was 0.7 or greater, that gender was assigned, and so this article was assigned as a man, woman, or MW article. We did this for all JoCN articles, and that yielded a new column of authorship gender categories, which served as our expected base rates for citation, and that gave rise to this plot that we saw a moment ago. We next determined the gender categories of the papers cited by JoCN articles. So JoCN citation lists, as seen in our example article, include only first name initials. However, the metadata included DOIs for each article's citations. Similarly, each of the articles categorized in the previous step had a corresponding DOI. So therefore, we used the column of DOIs as a lookup table for each of the citations in the reference lists of the JoCN articles. When a DOI was matched, we categorized that citation according to the gender category assigned in the previous step. Inspection of the citation rates reveals that women-led papers have been cited less frequently than the base rates and vice versa for papers. But it's important that we put these citation patterns into context by explicitly factoring in the base rates in order to determine the true extent to which citation patterns are imbalanced. Toward that end, we'll label the citation rates as the observed proportions and the base rates as the expected proportions. For each category, we then compute a gender citation balance index by subtracting the expected proportion from the observed proportion and divide by the expected proportion. A value of 0 indicates a citation rate as predicted by the prior, with positive and negative values indicating over and under citation compared to expected, respectively. So for JoCN, papers had a larger observed proportion than expected, yielding a positive index. The remaining categories all had negative indices, revealing an undercitation of women-led papers, with the WW category being the most undercited. Finally, we can break out by author gender category, and we see that the indices for citation lists of authored papers show a trend much like the overall trend we just observed. However, this group is not solely to blame, as we see a pattern similar for WW authored papers, as well as for the mixed gendered authored papers, albeit with minor variations in magnitude. So we have shown that gender imbalances in citation practices of neuroscience generalize to the subfield of cognitive neuroscience, and the pattern of these imbalances is consistent across authorship gender category, implicating systemic factors. So what's a field to do? Well, calling attention to findings like this is a great start. And finally, I've spent the past month or so developing a web tool, which is shown here, in which authors may submit a reference list and receive the gender category breakdown and gender citation balance indices in return. Here I submitted a reference list from a paper that we published earlier this year. And as you can see, it's coming. I too am guilty of citation imbalances in the same direction. So Dr. Brad Postal, in whose lab I work, is assuming the editor-in-chief role at JoCN, and will be encouraging authors to use this tool to see how their reference lists stack up as a first actionable step toward improving the citation balance. And I now look forward to our interactive discussion, and thank you very much for listening.
Owing to the online nature of this conference, this is the applause you hear from the attendees. If you had excellent work, Jacqueline. So we are waiting for questions. As we are waiting for questions, I'm just trying to see if I can quickly post this link to our attendees in the chat. Just give me one.
Sure.
Yep, perfect. This is great. And thank you for actually providing this tool, because this is what has happened. Like, as I'm listening to you, I have this question like, okay, well, I need to check how my citation practices are. And I've seen that there are some tools that are being developed, but they were like in test case, or like it's still not ready for the real world. But this is great. This is really good.
Well, I will say that this just has become, live, and so we're still in the process of working through it. But it does seem to be working well, and what we've found is people who have tested it, they've had the same sentiment. I'm curious to see where I'm at, and it seems that the majority of people so far have more or less this pattern. So,
Yeah, I mean, I can. Yeah, I can imagine, given the strong trend that you show across all these participants. Right. So I think we have a question.
Okay.
Oh, yes. So we have a couple of questions. First one is from Don Taylor. Great work. How much do you think the men-women imbalance of speaker selection at conferences impact awareness of men-women research, leading to this bias?
So that's an interesting point. So we're here really just to kind of shed light on these patterns. So we are not social psychologists, so we can't speak to all the potential sources of this, but certainly that could be one issue contributing. So when work is disseminated at a conference, it may get a little more feedback and press, and then make it easier to publish. So that could be one of many factors, certainly. And so the goal would also be to increase representation at conferences as well, and make sure that there's more dissemination of the results across all the different gender groups. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We have the next question, like, very interesting. Thank you. I wonder if some of the bias may stem from the traditional overrepresentation of male scientists. That is, do you give citations of old and new papers the same weight, assuming old papers were more likely to be authored by men?
Yes. So we purposely, for this analysis of JoCN, focused on the articles published within the 2009 to 2020 time range. Now, this, of course, means that there still could be references to much older papers, but as we've seen, at least in JoCN, the authorship is generally stable. So it's kind of in a point where the field is not changing all that much. And if people are tending to cite more recent papers, then, they should be citing kind of more at this level. What seems to just be happening is that, people in JoCN are citing the broad scope neuroscience journals in general more frequently than JoCN. And as I mentioned in passing at the beginning, the gender balance in the 5 broad scope journals is more skewed towards males. So I do think, yes, citing older papers would tilt the balance more in that direction, but also simply just citing outside into the broad scope journals is going to tilt the balance as well. So and that's why we're pushing towards looking at these indices, so balancing by the prior. So if your group does tend to be more male, that should be taken into account as well, that we would expect you to also cite more male papers.
So we have a question from a panelist, and I would recommend, Jorge, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. So. Jorge, are you talking? We are not able to hear you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Great work, Jacqueline. I was wondering what percentage of authors' genders were not able you were not able to classify, because you mentioned the 70% threshold for classifying them.
Yes. So in the JoCN analysis, we, through the first pass, had less than 10% that, for a variety of reasons, weren't categorized. In some cases, we had single author papers, and so we had to we then categorize them as either male or women papers. But then we did have a few cases where they weren't categorized. So in that case, because it was so few number of papers, we were able to visit faculty pages and journal websites, and if there were pronouns available, we were able to categorize those. So for the JoCN, it was maybe only a few authors in the end. For a much larger data set, for example, the 5 broad scope journals, then you start having many more articles to work with. And so in that case, I don't recall off the top of my head, but I think it was still about 10% or less that weren't categorized because of the probabilities. So
that's great. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We have one more question from Eleanor. Could you test if scientists also have a biased view of other scientists in the field, maybe with a questionnaire, meaning that they know more male than female scientists than the real ratio? This could explain why they cite males more.
So the previous study that I mentioned by Jordan Dworkin and Daniel Bassett and colleagues, they looked into what they called social networks. So they actually factored into these kinds of analyses for the 5 broad scope journals, the collaborators and people in their academic networks. And they found that even when you account for who people know and who people work with, this pattern of imbalances still emerged. So it's something beyond just who you know and who you happen to work with.
Great. I'm just sending this information to the attendees. Great. So Dan, why don't you unmute yourself and ask the question?
I guess I can. Yeah, it's really interesting. I wanted just a quick question about sort of the practical moving forward, knowing these imbalances exist. Like, what do you propose we do at the journal level? Should reviewers flag this if they notice there's a gender imbalance, or what do you recommend?
So if Brad Postal's here, he may have a little more to speak about that. But what he is hoping to implement at the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience is to encourage authors to use this tool. It's not going to be a mandatory requirement. And then they would report the outcomes from the tool, these boxes that we see here on the slide. And the idea would be that reviewers would see this information, but it would not be a factor in whether or not to accept or reject the paper, but rather if there is a strong imbalance, perhaps recommending some additional references that improve the balance, for example. But there's no penalty. It's really just a way of making people aware of this and potentially seeking out more of the literature that they can include that's relevant for their topic. And the hope is after a year, we could do an analysis to see whether this kind of tool is having an effect. So
It looks
Yeah.
like Brad has his hand raised, so I can allow him to talk. That's okay.
Yeah, sure. But it'll have to be pretty brief, unfortunately.
Okay. I think you're, yeah.
Yeah, Jackie actually said everything I was going to say. Thank you, Jackie. Wonderful talk.
Thank you.
All right. This is a very interesting and important area of concern for us. So we have a lot of questions, but unfortunately we have to move on to our next speaker. Jacqueline, in the meantime, can you try to answer them using the Q&A? That would be really helpful.
Sure.
So we have our next speaker.